drones coordinate amongst each other how to, they have to sense the situation, they have to communicate with each other, and then they have to act on those, sensed parameters to deliver on the goal that they are optimized to do. So there's a lot of
Wi-Fi.
existing.
How do those drones?
Oh,
sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, conviction voting. Conviction voting is really interesting because it's basically using some of the new affordances of blockchain, and that is that we have this rich temporal data stream to rethink some of our traditional methods of governance. So voting, we traditionally come together, once every 4 years or once every council meeting, and we say yes or no. It's a very binary time, like ad hoc voting. So you call a vote, you get the vote, and then you don't think about it for another little while. But with blockchains, we actually have the opportunity to think beyond that and introduce a temporal aspect into decision making so that we can kind of create this collective human organism and mimic some of the decision making processes we find in nature. So if we take the human brain, for example, you have neurons that are growing in action potential until they hit a threshold and then they fire. So this is basically what we're trying to model with conviction voting. So if we hold tokens and we exert those tokens towards a preference, like I think Gregory should be part of this group, you can also assert your tokens towards that. And these tokens grow in conviction, which is why it's called conviction voting, until they reach a certain threshold and they fire. So this is kind of a rethinking the potential for using blockchain in collective governance mechanisms. And that's one example. Actually, since we've put that out, the OneHive team, which is a dev team associated in the Aragon universe, has been working on conviction voting, and they've actually already come up with several different use cases for it. One of those being conviction funding. So how do you allocate, a communal pool of money to various proposals, which was one of our actually, we called that conviction voting. It's now kind of become conviction funding. There's also dynamic average consensus. So I suppose it depends what layer we're kind of talking on. In a technical community, you may have certain parameters that need to be agreed on. In a more high level community, it might be something like, what tax rate is fair, or what rate of UBI should we all be receiving? And you can actually have everyone kind of feeding their vote stream into that. Instead of a vote at a specific amount of point in time, you're streaming your preference, and that preference is aggregated among everyone in that community. So you get a continuous signal of what they may prefer regarding any parameter you could set in a community. Now, of course, that's presuming a few other things. There are limitations to direct democracy as opposed to liquid democracy. So I think we're still quite early in the experimentation of these ecosystems to think of them being applied to real world topics. But this is also why we're starting very small with small coordinated communities and seeing how these novel governance tools can be useful to making decisions as a collective.
Yeah, cool. Well, so one question I had, and I think this has come up in the Common Stack chat at least once that I've seen, is around conviction voting, for instance. I mean, in some ways, as a mechanism design, it's meant to make it a little bit better, make voting, or maybe a lot better, for anonymous communities of token holders, where you could have different token holders, whales, sort of like exerting undue influence that actually is counter to the common good, and instead is extracting more value for themselves. And there's a way in which conviction voting kind of ameliorates that a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily go all the way in the way that a system that uses some sort of identity does. So could you just talk a little bit about the tension there and what you're seeing and what's evolving and how people are conceptualizing that?
For sure. Yeah. So the immediate application of conviction voting, I guess I was talking a little bit more about applications down the road. The immediate application of conviction voting is trying to address the last minute vote swings that we see in some of the Aragon vote processes. So there, I mean, you still have a very small percentage of token holders ultimately voting. So I think around 3%, 4%. And in one of the AGP processes, you saw there was a consensus, either yes or no on a certain proposal up until 10 minutes before the vote finished, and a whale came in and exerted, a massive influence in one direction and switched it from no to yes or yes to no. And we see this as, plutocratic control of democratic processes, which is a problem. So conviction voting, what it does is it limits the ability for a whale to come in at the last minute and exert that preference, because it introduces time as a component. So if there is a minority that has voted all the way along for a yes or no, then that is growing in conviction. And if a whale comes in, even if they hold, a dominant token vote amount of tokens, their tokens aren't worth as much as a minority if they come in at the last minute. Now, as you mentioned, this doesn't completely eliminate the plutocratic attack vector, because if a whale and a minnow vote at the same time, of course, the whale has more impact to vote because both of their votes are growing in conviction over time. However, another important part of the common stack is interoperability and modularity. So we see conviction voting and quadratic voting fitting together quite nicely. So you could have a temporal aspect, but also quadratic voting basically attempts to balance out the power between majority holders and minority holders. It's more or less a tacit agreement of the rich to subsidize the minority because they value those people and don't want them to just leave because they have no power. Which, exit is kind of the rallying cry of the crypto space and the libertarian, I guess, bent in general. But quadratic voting we see as kind of helping to balance that between whales and minnows. And conviction voting can also help in giving the people who have been around longer more voice than the people who are coming in last minute and trying to influence things that the community may not agree with.
Got it.
So the composition of these tools is really important, and we see a lot of amazing experiments in the crypto space, but it seems like people are focusing more on individual mechanisms than on composition of mechanisms. So mechanisms such as holographic.
Definitely.
Yeah. And one of my favorite tools is holographic consensus by DAOstack. I think this is fantastic. It's kind of using the prediction wisdom of the crowd to predict what will be more useful or less. But I see that as part of a I think that would be really useful for a proposal backlog system, where if you have 1,000 proposals on the table and you have a community of 100 people, no one has the time to read through 1,000 proposals and see, are all of these worthwhile? You could have, holographic consensus choose the top 20 out of those 1,000, for example. And then you could use the Giveth proposal engine. Actually, I have the diagram up here now. Maybe I'll share my screen quickly. Can you see that diagram that I'm pointing to here?
Yeah. Yep. Okay,
perfect. So yeah, this is the whole cyber physical commons system. So if you can think of everything within this box is kind of within the local economy of the augmented bonding curve. So we're creating almost like a cell, if you can think of it that way. Outside of this box is the external economy. Inside of this box is the internal economy. And there's a lot of interesting parallels here that, I read an article not too long back where they were saying the beginning of life, the beginning of single-celled organisms came with the cell wall. As soon as there was a cell wall, it created a membrane that kept resources within that as opposed to the resources without that. And then you could, you had things like mitochondria, you had other things forming within the cell wall, and this was the beginning of life. This is a viable system. So this is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the same structure here, is that we now have in the bonding curve, in the creation of an internal economy versus the external economy, you now have the potential for circular economies, more efficient flows of information within these economies that can now produce kind of similar to the Ronald Coase, the structure of the firm. There's boundaries around a company that promote increased flows of communication and value within that firm. This is kind of the same thing, but now for a decentralized community. So you can see, I won't go through all of this because there's quite a bit to digest here, but there are different ways for value to flow into and out of this economy. Some of those are financial, so you have people contributing capital by buying tokens. You also have people earning tokens through completing work. So those tokens that are purchased are then exerted through conviction voting. So there are a number of proposals that are on the table. When any of those proposals aggregate an appropriate amount of conviction, they are triggered, they begin, then work is carried out, funds are distributed to the people who carry out that work, work is complete and value is delivered. That value may have additional revenue feeding back into this community. So you're kind of creating a biological system for community production of value, and primarily around public goods, which is where we see a lot of the traditional business models failing to produce viable public goods. And I think that's where there's some really big opportunity for alternative economic models. There aren't good business models to provide sustainable public goods, but maybe we can create economic models. We can realign incentives so that there is the production of value for everyone involved without the extraction that we see so often in our capitalist economic systems.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I sort of think about a lot is that at the moment, and the devil's in the details, but what you're outlining there, I would say, is something like the transformation of public goods into common goods.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you're sort of like, you're able to govern and account for and have a discrete number of people who are governed, and obviously Elinor Ostrom did an amazing job about sort of like outlining principles of successful commons governance aggregated from examples all around the world. And that translation, instead of trying to privatize goods, or you can sort of commonize goods, if that makes sense, and therefore you can create common good outcomes in a way that is neither sort of state mandated, which is traditionally the way that public goods are stewarded, is through some sort of state taxation mechanism, et cetera, which in today's day and age, I mean, obviously a lot of this is influenced by sort of like a voluntaristic sort of libertarian bent of like, well, we need to figure out on our own how to sort of self-regulate. And so that, now maybe bridging into the philosophical, that's one of the things I find most interesting, actually, is that this sort of like that techno-libertarianism is sort of like has encountered and is falling in love with the commons. And the commons has traditionally been the domain of sort of like the, I don't know, anarcho-greens, or the sort of like the communities that wouldn't necessarily conventionally want anything to do with markets necessarily,
right?
Or would be very wary of market mechanisms as a way of achieving sort of common good outcomes, right?
Exactly.
So tell me a little bit, how does that observation strike you? And on that sort of philosophical, socio-political spectrum, what are you observing around who's resonating with this work at the intersection of markets, commons, and crypto technology, crypto networks?
Yeah, it's a extremely interesting area, because I think some of the new affordances of blockchains and Web3 tech in general blurs a lot of the traditional lines that some people, I mean, it really depends who you're speaking to. I think one of our biggest difficulties has been translation. A word that resonates with one group is antithetical to another one. There's words like profit. When you're speaking in terms of a market, people are like, oh, okay, profit means you are, providing a service that people find useful. When you say that in a commons conversation, it screams of exploitation and externalization of damage and so on and so forth. So it's really tricky to kind of figure out the language that works with these groups. But I think what we are seeing is a tighter coupling between markets and governance. Right now we have, governance is imposed after the fact. You have governments step in and say, well, okay, if you polluted, you have to pay this carbon tax. But there's all sorts of kind of blurring of the lines and a lot of gray area in between, like the profit that's made, the externalization of damage, and then the tax that's imposed after the fact to fix that. And I think what we're verging on here is building the governance into the market and internalizing the externality. And I'm not saying that's a priori what these systems are about, but I think we have the potential to do that with this technology. Sorry, did you have a follow on from that?
Well, no, I think I see that as well. I think it's well said too, that it's not, we can't take it for granted that these sorts of systems will just intrinsically internalize previously externalized costs, but they do offer building blocks that may make that process much easier, which I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited. I mean, that's sort of, in a nutshell, what Regen Network is even aiming a little bit beyond that. We're not just trying to internalize previously externalized costs. We're trying to create positive externalities, or those common or public goods through business, through the way that relationships are happening. So it's interesting to me. I mean, I certainly come from a worldview in which I can very much understand the perspective. I can understand both perspectives, but I can really understand the perspective in which we can understand, by and large, profit in today's economy is strongly correlated with, if not nearly exactly the same as the value being extracted from living systems, whether they be cultural or biological. That is, basically that's the
margin.
That's the margin. By and large. I mean, there are always exceptions, but that's, I think, a pretty decent rule of thumb. So, I think it's exciting to be working towards ways that that we can re-internalize those costs, because I do think, I'm hopeful that Common Stack and some of the other more hopeful projects in the crypto sphere are sort of harbingers of a world in which the markets and successful competition in markets is around, like the competition is how well you're serving health and how well you're producing quality and novelty and serving in a way that cares for the stakeholders that you're engaged with, instead of how well are you able to externalize costs and disenfranchise and fragment the stakeholders and community that you're engaged with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot to learn from existing systems, and we see in capitalism and evolution in general. There's a lot of emphasis on competition. You know, the it's good to have competition in a market, multiple companies that are trying to provide the same service, because that competition will make them, you know, provide better services for lower costs, which is better for the consumer. And I think what we're verging on now is having competition between currencies, which is actually something that Hayek touched on, and I don't think it's as well known, at least not to myself before coming across it. Was that right now we have currency monocultures. And in agriculture, you know, it's well recognized how dangerous monocultures are, because they increase the brittleness of your system. You know, if there's drought or there's a pest, you know, in a monoculture you lose a whole crop. Versus permaculture, you have diversity, you have resilience. And right now we have a monoculture of currencies around the world, and basically all generated almost the same way, state-backed, interest-based, and so on and so on. And now we're seeing a renaissance of currency creation, and now having different currency systems being able to compete to provide services and provide incentives for different things. And again, that can go in every direction. I think 99.9% of what we see out there is still an experiment. But as we continue to evolve through this process of figuring out how we design these and discovering these repeatable tools and patterns that can be used, we can get better and better at creating alternative economic models to provide common goods, or turning public goods into common goods so that they can be useful, but at the same time sustained economically, and really start to see a new paradigm of providing these services for ourselves, because we can include stakeholders that are traditionally left out, you know, in the economic models of today through tokenization.
Yeah, say more about that, because I think that's maybe something that let's see if we can cross that bridge from assumptions that I share, but I think are sort of like latent and not well explicated. They're sort of like embedded in sort of like the crypto sphere and insiders of the crypto world. This is driven, this sort of competition between currencies and tokenization are sort of fundamental pillars of how we assume the world is going to transform. But I don't think that people outside of that very insular community have a sense of that, and they probably, I mean, I think it's true to it's true that we can see what happened in 2017 and you know, the beginning of 2018 and the ICO boom and sort of the Wild West, you know, almost like wildcat banking all over again, you know, playing out all over the world. I think people, when they think of tokenization now, a lot of people are going to just sort of like think, oh, okay, so you're sort of like minting money out of nothing and getting people to believe in it, sort of like and again, it's like this too has happened before, just like the beginning of the stock markets. People were creating joint stock companies that were doing nothing and doing big campaigns to raise money and whatnot. So it's sort of like, okay, we've gone in these cycles. So taking a historical perspective, you know, where are we now, and how can we defend and invite the understanding that tokenization and competition between currencies is inevitable? Let's dig into that and defend it a little bit. And where are we at in the cycle, and what do we need to be thinking about right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think crypto as a whole and tokenization is still very much so like attributed to Bitcoin. Like when people hear about blockchain, they think Bitcoin, and they like this whole get rich quick mentality still surrounds a lot of the space. And I mean, I think that's quite unfortunate, but I think still most of the experiments we see are just kind of replications along that same meme. And I think the introduction of token engineering, which is kind of being pioneered by block science and brought into the crypto space through the Common Stack, and I mean a number of other projects are very interested in kind of this more rigorous formalization of tools, and that comes first and foremost with CAD. which is the simulation and modeling tool that was released by Block Science just about a year ago now. And that's where we can start to simulate and model and have a better understanding of the full range of scenarios that could play out in these ecosystems. I think there's still a lot of mistrust around these currencies, and trust is the core component of a currency. If you don't have trust in it, then people won't use it, and then it really defeats the whole purpose. So I think once we can build up the technology and the foundation, the mathematical and engineering foundations of these, and show that there's a real world use case out there. And I think that also is a process. There are some really interesting projects and initiatives that are going on now. One of which being the Red Cross Community Inclusion Currencies project in Kenya, which Block Science is contracting to build the model and the simulations of this system. And then once we give it a use case that people can identify with and see a need for, I think that it will become much more apparent as to how these can play out in the real world. And I think COVID actually gives us a really good opportunity to speak about some of those opportunities. I've actually been reached out by a couple of communities in Canada who want to launch a local currency because they see the issue of, now I can't go to work, my neighbors can't go to work, but we still need to interact. We still need to exchange, and I still have goods or time, labor, but there's no money to facilitate that exchange. As soon as we have a use case and a product that people can use, I think this stuff will just flow much more. But I think we're still designing transistors. We're still designing mechanisms in most of the blockchain space today. We're designing capacitors and resistors and inductors. People don't want capacitors, resistors, and inductors. They want a computer. As soon as you can combine those components in a way that is useful to someone, it will take off. The internet was around since the 70s, but no one really used it other than the super nerds until the 90s when there was a browser and email. But there was 2 decades of development of internet technologies that, most people looked at it and they were like, what? I don't get it. Like TCP/IP and packet switching and like, what? Why? But as soon as you give them, a repository of global data that is accessible through this interface, it's a no-brainer. But I think we have to get the technology to that level, and it's about building on those layers of abstraction. We don't just need, gates. We don't just need chips. We need a product that is built on the modular composition of all of these tools to provide something useful to the end user. And I think that will come about through improving and iterating those engineering models as we go.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. And you need sort of visions of the completed system and little tastes of it to sort of drive, adoption and demand and excitement. It's interesting. I was reached out to by some folks that I'm closely connected to in Ecuador, where there's a local seed saving and food network, and they have this big coronavirus induced capital crunch, economic crisis that I think most parts of the world are facing as well. Although there, I think it's more acute because they were already in a big crisis from sort of a petroleum induced, and foreign debt induced crisis. So they were already in a downward spiral, and then it got worse. And I was talking with them about some sort of mutual credit, local currency, where people who are producers and consumers in a local supply network could exchange. And I have to be honest, I sort of did a quick search and chatted with some people, and none of the tools in the crypto space were even, I was just like, nothing's anywhere close. But there's like a Drupal, there's like an old Drupal mutual credit system. I was like,
yeah,
exactly. I was just like, just use that. There's small enough community, have an a sysadmin that everybody trusts, and just do that. And don't it's just sort of there are tools out there. Just use what makes sense. I don't know that it actually there's also, with those sort of mutual credit systems, there's a critical mass. You need a critical mass of people.
Right.
You know, it needs to be, you know, I don't know what the threshold is, but it's, you know, it's probably more than 1,000 users.
That's one of the things I want to do some testing on the model that we've developed with the Red Cross, is to determine what is the minimum economy size to achieve that critical mass that you can create these internal circular effects within an economy. And
what's the usage ratio too? Because
right.
I live in this small town, Great Barrington. Schumacher Center for New Economy is
nice.
You know, down the road. They and some of my friends, you know, working there, created the Berkshire, which was an early local complementary currency. You know, most businesses take them. The bank, you know, the bank takes them. The co-op, you know, all the local businesses on Main Street and everything. But I have to say, nobody uses them. And I've been meaning to call up Schumacher and be like, do you guys have numbers? Do you have data? Can you tell? Did it change during the crisis? What's going on here? But even me, I love the concept and I love the idea, but it was just like for whatever reason, there's like a separation between the idea and the intention and the reality that everybody was living. And part of that is because essentially the Berkshire, the incentive's wrong, because the store owner actually gets it's like 90 cents on the dollar or something. It's
90
like,
or 95, yeah.
Yeah, and so you know, they're kind of like doing it. They're getting taxed, basically,
yeah.
And they're all struggling, and so they're all kind of like they're not going to encourage
right
the use of the Berkshire necessarily. They'll take it.
Yeah, I actually just listened to a podcast on that with David Bollier, and I think her name was Moriarty, with Berkshires, and she said, you know, this is a physical cash system. We actually don't have data on it. We prefer anecdotes, and like they have all sorts of anecdotes. You know, it helped this business do this, it helped this consumer do this, but they don't have the data. And I think the data is so critical. And actually, I think Grassroots Economics has one of the best dashboards. Actually, maybe I can pull it up here. I mean, it's you know, generation one of this kind of data. But let me show.
Have you seen these?
Quickly. Oops. What is that? I've seen the bill. I can't read the writing.
I'll show you after you show me this, and then I'll show you that.
Sure. Yeah. So this is, from what I've seen, one of the most in-depth data dashboards of a local currency system. And again, a caveat here: this is a centralized system, and I think when we look at, you know, launching crypto communities or crypto tokens into real-world applications, especially as it, you know, involving marginalized communities. This is in rural Kenya. So we have to be very careful about, you know, doing this on a completely decentralized network. What are the attack vectors? How could this be, you know, taken over by, you know, mischievous actors? So this is a centralized implementation. It's run by Grassroots Economics. So, I mean, if you're a crypto purist, you may say this isn't, like, why even use a blockchain? But really we can start to progressively decentralize these systems as the technology becomes better and better, and, you know, we come across, you know, established consensus mechanisms that make sense. But I think the real power in using blockchain is the opportunity to leverage massive amounts of data and see, you know, the amount of trade. You know, you can break it down by gender, and again, of course, data sensitivity, but we can see that you know, this benefits female currency holders in Kenya. And I mean, they're generally the ones that are trading in these circumstances. The men are often, you know, out of the village and working somewhere. But you can see, you know, the number of transactions that occur.
This is all done on cell phones. Is that correct? It's like a like cell phone based credit system.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's very similar to M-Pesa. So it's on feature phones. So, like, you know, you hit *611 and it gives you a menu, and I say send money. Enter the phone number. I put in your phone number, and it transfers the money via feature phones. Or, I mean, you can also do it smartphone enabled but they've started with the kind of M-Pesa feature phone model. But yeah, there's tons to see here, and actually the most important part in my mind is you have the amount of value in transaction. So we have 22.4 million Kenyan shillings in trade, basically off of 1.62 million shillings. And so a shilling is about a penny. So you can 100 shillings to $1. So if you divide all these numbers by 100, you're basically at the US dollar. So we've got 22.4 million shilling in trade, based off of 1.62 million shilling in support by the Red Cross. So in other words, you have a 20x, almost 20x leverage in every Red Cross aid dollar that's sent to these communities. So
this is Will's project. That's correct. This is
exactly
Reddick. Yeah.
Will Reddick. Yeah.
Cool.
So I think this kind of dashboarding is one of the really big potentials for local currencies, because all of a sudden you can say to the Red Cross, because worldwide cash voucher assistance is the gold standard for aid these days. They don't, back in the day they used to send canned food, or they would send medicine, or they would send clothes, and they realized what they were actually doing is decimating the local economy for those products. So now they generally send cash. If there's a community in Kenya that has suffered an extended period of drought, they just give everyone some money, and that money can be spent in the local economy and stimulate the local economy for more benefit to the community members. But giving $1 in worth of Kenyan shillings is a 1-for-1 impact ratio. If you then turn that dollar into actually they have a 4x leverage, so they give them for every Red Cross aid dollar, they create $4 worth of sarafu, which actually just means currency in Swahili, but that is the local currency. And then as long as that circulates locally, so they see about a 5x velocity of money improvement with the local currency versus a national currency. So that 4x on currency creation plus 5x local velocity of money equates to about a 20x leverage for every aid dollar that's sent to this Kenyan village. So
yeah, that's cool. It's exciting to see the numbers. It's exciting to see the numbers, and it's sort of like many years ago, I was kind of like more integrated in the local currency scene, and I'm just excited to see. It's interesting. It's an interesting topic. It's really fascinating. What I was going to show you here was some of my crypto friends created this. I don't know if you've seen the Kong buck.
I have, yeah, cool.
So this is physical currency with a little chip right here. Check that out. And it's
nice.
Secure execution. It's linked to an Ethereum address, and you can back it with cryptocurrency, and you can have anonymous cash-based trade.
Cool.
Which I think is pretty interesting in terms of just the intersection of, the crypto sphere, potentially local. So if you thought like, okay, members of the Ethereum community, you could use this in order to support communities around the world and have DAI-backed local currencies with some sort of decentralized banking system. It's going to happen one way or the other, but it's it's cool. It's exciting. Whether it happens in a way that is actually governed, maybe, luckily I don't have any interest in DAI. I find the maker governance to be totally, it's beyond me, why everybody uses DAI, but whatever, people, you can do your own thing. It's useful. It works. That's great. That's all you need to know. In my mind, the difference between DAI and Tether is like nothing. I can't discern any real difference in terms of rigor and reality of governance. But now that I've thrown them under the bus, we can move on.
Yeah. And I mean, I think all of these are, again, like great experiments. I think all of the crypto space up until this point has been a big R&D test bed. And
totally, and that's the right framing.
Yeah.
Don't let me be a hater. It's true.
No,
It's
not at all.
really fantastic. They're really fantastic experiments, and we're learning a lot. I'm excited. I love that, and I'm sort of like in the crypto space, I'm kind of like heretical in the fact that I never wanted to really participate so much in the Ethereum community, but I love it. I love the avant-garde experimental, like build stuff and whatever. But I always looked at the building blocks and just like the way everything was, and I was like, that's not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think, there's all sorts of progress being made in the Cosmos ecosystem. And actually, I've been blown away by your team and your team's contributions in the Cosmos ecosystem, and definitely the technical knowledge and also philosophical and obvious desire for regeneration and sustainability of your team to be incredibly inspiring. And I think it's been great to see
Thank you.
The progress.
No, I mean,
there.
I think we're kind of crazy. I mean, how we ended up, essentially becoming a layer one player, is a little bit beyond me in a way. I think I was thinking about this earlier today. I think it's just as a team, our ethos is just sort of like, if you've got to take out the trash, you just have to take out the trash. Like,
yeah,
just, we had a set of assumptions about good governance, and what you were talking about earlier really resonated. If you're going to create a currency, people have to trust it. If people are going to trust it, then it has to have integrity. And if it's going to have integrity, then you need to be really immaculate and transparent and have the right governance feedback loops around the very most basic infrastructure of things, right? And that's where we were like, well, then we got to go all the way to layer one. We have to go all the way to the building blocks, and the only thing that makes sense is like self-sovereign systems that the users ultimately can go all the way down, and they can change something when it doesn't work, or it's creating a perverse incentive, or something's not aligned. There has to be a way for that to happen from the beginning. And so we started with that assumption, and Cosmos was is like the early leader in seeing that and trying to create the tools so that people who had that realization could spin up their own sort of sovereign state machines and create their own modules and their own governance and their own things. And so and I just love the community there is really great in a lot of ways, and we just sort of like rolled our sleeves up, and we just started like we sort of synced up where everything was actually at. Like we're just like, here we are. Oh, we have to solve that before we can do the next thing. And it's, and it's been great. And I'm super grateful and excited about that community. Actually, I think there's a bunch of progress being made. I'm excited. I'm also excited to see Polkadot come up online and see what happens there with that sort of different model, different worldview, solving similar problems. I'm really excited for ETH 2.0. And I'm really excited. What I'm most excited about is getting to the composability where, like we can create composable, like we can pull something from common stack and we can just deploy it. You can just deploy it over here. And what matters is the governance. It doesn't matter which tech stack you used or what the code was. What matters is that it's open, that it's composable, that it's modular, that, the governance is in the right place and people have choice. So the community of users can choose, we want our currency to have the following attributes. We want to tax ourselves in the following ways. We want to, compete on the following things. And then all of a sudden, that's the, sort of magic moment, right? For the competition of magic internet money.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Against state issued sort of military backed currencies.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, Regen Network is definitely one of those projects that has such an appeal to non-crypto people. Realigning incentives around regenerative agriculture and agricultural systems. Like that's just such a clear need that so many people get behind. But then, you know, digging into it further, and I saw the depth that your team goes into with the technical build. And I mean, it's wonderful that you guys have those technical chops to dig into that group, to that layer. But I feel like there are so many other regen network, people who want to start a regen network, but they don't have the ability to drill down to that. So I'm excited for when the technology can come up to
Exactly.
just facilitating people in doing these things rather than having to get involved in building it from scratch.
I resonate with that. I really, I was thinking about that also earlier today. I was like, man, I wonder what would have happened if I had, as a sort of technological neophyte and even skeptic, if I had, had this vision that was calling me in 5 years and instead of 3 years ago or whatever, what will the building blocks be, and how long would it take to just do it? Like, just to be like, oh
yeah,
you can throw that in, you can throw that together, these people already have that going, you just connect it and you put it all together, and then all of a sudden, whatever, a month later, and with 10,000 bucks or something, you sort of get to the same place. Whereas, right now we're just sort of like, wow, got to slog through and build that piece and that piece. They don't exist. They just don't exist. There's no way to do those things.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, though, I'd love your opinion on this. I've been thinking a lot recently about the radical difference in organizational style, focus, and just like startup life between like a crypto project and an old Web 2.0 sort of like move fast and break things, lean sort of software play. And I don't know if you have any thoughts, if that's something you think about a lot. Like, what does the crypto world have to learn from that space? And where is the model just totally different? And, it's actually a different game with different rules and a different reality in which things will just look very different.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, at least in my experience, starting, being with the Common Stack from the get-go, looking for funding options, moving forward with this, a lot of the grants that we've applied to, we've explored VC funding. A lot of the time we seem to get shoehorned into like the startup mentality, and like, what is your product market fit? What is your your revenue model? Like, how are you going to turn this into a product? And a lot of the time we're like, well, we don't actually want to do those things. We're not trying to capture value produced by this thing, which is, I mean, what investors are typically looking for. If you're looking at the startup Web 2.0 VC model, they're looking to, fund an early initiative and then cash out huge when it either, when the founder exits or it goes to IPO or whatnot. And I think the key difference with Web3 is we're now considering, how value can be split equitably between all stakeholders, that being users included primarily, not just investors and team, but the users and stakeholders down the line. And I think that is the key to this whole movement, is that you don't have the value capture, by the end protocol, but you can share it throughout the stack with all of the involved parties. So I think
agreed. And what I'm hearing from you is, like, at this stage, you guys, it's like it's R&D. It's not necessarily a startup even. It's a research and development, cooperative. And sure, it's like you look and maybe there's opportunities to create something, and users value that and they use it and they cycle back funds, but those funds would eventually are meant to be reinvested in continuing the R&D, not necessarily providing a bigger upside for some future liquidation event.
Right. And I think that's the real value proposition of tokenization in general, is that we can provide a an accounting system for something other than financial return. And I think that's one of the biggest failings of, you know, our one-dimensional financial system, is that everything boils down to the bottom dollar, and things that aren't accounted for in either profits or losses are kind of externalized. Things like, you know, the social dynamics or the environmental dynamics can get externalized, and they don't show on the balance sheet, so that can just happen. But with tokens, we can start to account for different ecological services or social services or stakeholder inclusion, and actually have a way to balance that against just the purely financial profit or loss, which I think drives a lot of traditional business models.
Well, so let me ask a provocative question there. Is quantification and is the financialization, monetization, or tokenization of something that has intrinsic value the most effective way to have it be considered?
Yeah, I think ultimately that's a very difficult question to answer, because like reductionism is not the way to complex systems analysis, but we do need to figure out a holistic way to get a better picture of this, and reducing that in complexity to a single metric will always fail. And I think we see that in you know, in what's it, Goodhart's law, is it? Whatever is measured will become optimized for and defeat the point of the measure in the first place. So like engagements on social media, as soon as you design you know, these systems to get a like, then you're going to optimize for behavior like clickbait behavior and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to reduce to one measure, but I think we need to expand our the metrics that we account for, not saying that any one measure is the important one, but having a richer field of sensing in terms of what kind of benefits are we delivering to these ecosystems, what kind of damages are we delivering to these ecosystems, and what kind of balance works moving forward. So I think it's about holism versus reductionism. And it's not about quantification, but it is about getting a better picture of how we deliver value and take away value from various ecosystems that we exist in.
Yeah, I think well answered. I mean, I think oftentimes one way that I consider that sort of provocative question, which is, you know, what's the right relationship between holism and reductionism? What's the right relationship between sort of quality and quantity? You know, I sort of think of, you know, I've got 2 kids, you know, me checking their temperature and getting a quantified number does not in any way undermine my ability to sort of like love them as a whole being. Right. And I think, you know, and I think there is a sort of like overreaction to reductionism, which is understandable from sort of like maybe some of the more heartfelt philosophers among us around like, how could we, like, you know, quantifying soil health, you know, we get this a lot. Sometimes I think the biggest threat to Regen Network is actually the best meaning people who want to see a more beautiful world. And, you know, they're sort of like, but we can't quantify everything. And we, you know, you're just reducing it. You're just doing the same thing. And it's like, well, I don't know. Does creating a interface to increase the sense-making capability of a community around the health of the living systems that keep them alive, is that reductionism, or is that just an up-leveling of capacity? And is, you know, there's an element of reholing and reconnecting to a wholeness that, you know, that quantification can do. And that's sort of what I heard in your answer as well, is, you know, it isn't that we're just trying to reduce something, it's that we're trying to get the right quantitative information to the right place at the right time in order for there to be a relationship. And that's sort of, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
Right. And I think that's the power and the deficiency of markets, is that price is an aggregated measure, but it's only a one-dimensional measure. And I think we can increase the dimensionality of that and get a much bigger, better understanding of the externalities that we're imposing on our natural systems. There's a quote by Donella Meadows that I always come to regarding kind of quantification, and she says, "No one can define or measure justice, democracy, security, freedom, truth, or love. No one can define or measure any value. But if no one speaks up for them, if systems aren't designed to produce them, if we don't speak about them and point toward their existence or absence, they will cease to exist." So it's about not necessarily quantifying to reduce, but quantifying to capture and signal and show that we value these things. And I don't think that needs to be reductionist. Of course, it depends what you do with that measure. If you take that temperature of your son and see that it's too high and say, "Oh, you're sick, I'm not going to touch you," there's an issue there of the way that you're treating your son based on the quantification of that data. But there's other ways that that you can react to that. There are appropriate ways to react and there are inappropriate ways to react, in my opinion. And it's very contextual and depending on the humans that are in this system.
Yeah, definitely. It sort of makes me think of some of Nora Bateson's work on warm data. I don't know if you've seen some of that. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, it's good. Sort of reconnecting the numbers to what they actually mean and making sure that that's what's happening actually.
Right.
And that's, to me, that's a, in a way, technically speaking, that's only really possible with Web3. Because that's where, a piece of data is not just a piece of data, it's related. It has, a community is choosing to have some level of consensus around a few key pieces of how, sort of the metadata, what it's related to, where it came from, who issued it, what's the story of this bit, not just this is a bit.
Definitely. And I think that ties right into our idea of the cyber physical commons and computer-aided governance. I'm not sure if you saw the piece on computer-aided governance, but CAD is that tool. And I've read about warm data. I don't know. I haven't heard of any particular architectures that they are suggesting to make use of warm data. But I
don't think it's gotten to that.
Okay, cool. Because I think CAD will play that role in the cyber physical commons, at least, because this is kind of a digital twin of the economy. So do you know about digital twins? Should I?
Mm-hmm. But I think it's a useful thing maybe to give a quick introduction, but yeah.
Yeah. So complex systems, when they engineer, for example, an airplane engine, those parts have a digital twin. So the airplane takes a 12-hour flight from London to Bangkok. Well, the digital twin of that engine also takes a 12-hour flight. And at the end of that flight, they compare, the readout of the real engine with the readout of the digital twin. And if there are any differences, that's a sign to the engineer and the mechanics that we need to look into this. The simulation says it should be at 200 degrees and it's actually at 300. Oh, maybe there's an issue here we should look into. So a digital twin is basically like a feedback loop between a simulation and the real world environment that they can now analyze, what may be going wrong or where a problem may be existing. So with CAD, we can now create a digital twin of an economy. So you could have, a local currency system, for example, running in Kenya, and all these agents are interacting. And at the same time, you could have a digital twin of that economy with all of these agents interacting. And you can compare and contrast. You can feed in real world data to that model and see where exactly are the issues here, or where are the failing points that we need to address in this socioeconomic system, and how can we make sure that we are serving the needs of the people in this community. So I think warm data really comes into it there, because you have this rich temporal data stream of agent interactions, and that may not just be buying and selling, it may also be voting, it may also be regenerating ecosystems, depending on the nature of the network we're analyzing, and be able to feed that information back in so that we can have informed decision making. Let's say, what if we raise our tax rate to 40%? run it in the simulation and say, well, hey, we're raising the tax rate to 40%. What are all the agents going to do? You can kind of see that in a data model that respects complexity before you launch it in a real world system and realize that that currency is going to hyperinflate or collapse or you know, whatever may come out of that. So it's a really interesting new opportunity to get kind of predictive analysis, not predictions, but you know, we do this all the time. We do this with flight networks. You know, there's an insane amount of information going on with you know, global flight traffic, and all of that goes through incredibly detailed computation, and it's basically delivered to the human agent in a understandable way, such that they can exert influence over that network without needing to understand every single complex detail that's going on in global flight traffic around the world.
Yeah, and so CAD is essentially just agent-based economic modeling interface for designing and testing token schemes, essentially. And you're saying it also, you can, you know, use it in larger non-token scenarios. Like you could use CAD to model, you know, the U.S. economy or something if you wanted to.
It would be very difficult to model the U.S. economy or any, you know, cash-based economy because there aren't those data streams to provide that good information. Actually, a lot of this comes down to in engineering, you need invariants, you need constraints, and all of our good engineering relies on constraints. So like electrical engineering, you have V equals IR. Civil engineering, you have F equals MA, you have E equals MC squared. This is how we can design skyscrapers that don't just collapse, you know, because you have some fundamental invariant that the system relies on which you can like base higher order mathematics and tools and techniques and so on. In the designs we've been working on, the invariant actually comes in through the bonding curve. So we create, and we haven't spoken much about token bonding curves, so I don't know if the math is the right place to introduce this, but there is some invariant between supply and reserve. Do you know about bonding curves? Actually, there's one going on in the Cosmos ecosystem through IXO. I don't know if you've looked into the work that Sean Conway's been doing. I think they call it cosmic bonding.
Yeah, no, well, I was there at the hackathon that they first, that he and Simply VC were first working on that. And actually, I'm going to have Sean on in 2 weeks to chat about the work that they've been doing. So I've been, I don't think any of it, they haven't been sharing it so much yet because it's not done yet, but I'm very excited that there's going to be a, you know, open source module that IXO has been leading and Interchain Foundation supported and Block Science been working on. So, and I think Simply VC has been doing a bunch of the work there as well. So I'm really excited about that. They're all, all friends and colleagues. So it's exciting to see that move. Yeah, no, I'd love for you to dig in a little bit to sort of augmented bonding curve work. I'm always keen to understand more. I admit I don't completely grok the math behind it, I think, yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I grok the math behind it either. I've realized I exist on some layers and I don't need to go all the way down to grasp that. But I can also get to a point that I'm comfortable that I know what's going on without necessarily being able to reproduce all the math myself.
Yep. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
The bonding curve, I think, offers a solution to one of the biggest problems in the crypto space. In most tokens today, you have very, very thin order books. So aside from maybe a half dozen or a dozen tokens that have decent trading volume, most of the tokens out there are open to pump and dump attacks and extreme volatility, because if you have thin order books, so in other words, I guess a bit of explanation on market systems. Exchanges are where buyers and sellers go to facilitate transactions. So if I want to sell a token for $10 and you want to buy a token for $10, then we are matched on an exchange and the deal goes through from me to you or you to me, depending who's buying and selling. With a bonding curve, we now have a one-sided market. So you have a smart contract that mints or burns tokens according to the collateral put in or taken out. So I put DAI or dollars into the smart contract, it mints tokens and sends them to me. When I want to sell those tokens, I send those tokens back to the smart contract where they're burned and the collateral is returned to me. So we now have a one-sided market. And this, I think, is going to revolutionize the crypto space. And I mean, you see this playing out through Uniswap or Balancer or Bancor. Like, there's a lot of different kind of liquidity pools, which is essentially what the bonding curve is in a way. But what the bonding curve really offers is an invariant for these economic systems moving forward. So you have some guaranteed ratio between supply and reserve. So you say for every dollar that's put in, there are 2 tokens generated. Or I mean, that's a linear bonding curve. You can also get a little more sophisticated. You can put a curve in there, so you can, incentivize certain types of behavior over others. But once you have that invariant, you have what's the word I'm looking for? A stable foundation for higher level mathematics to rest on. It's the invariant that makes it a stable system. And essentially, like the way Zargham explains it that I really like, it's designing economic space. And when you design economic space, you can now have predictable behavior of the agents in that space because they can't leave that surface. So what is a good okay, three-dimensional space. If you have three-dimensional space, it's just empty space, anything can happen. But as soon as you reduce the dimensionality of that and you say, there's a certain invariant for life to evolve. So life evolved on the surface of the earth, right? Life didn't evolve in the middle of nothing in space. It evolved on the surface of the earth because you have an invariant. The invariant is at any point on the surface of the earth, you're equidistant to the equator. So now you reduce the dimensionality of free space, and now resources were able to start, aggregating on the surface of the planet. We had single-celled life, multi-celled life, and evolving up to where we are now. If you didn't have that reduction of dimensionality, then it is very unlikely that life would just start to exist in outer space. So as soon as you introduce an invariant, you allow for conditions of interaction and predictability, I guess. So if you create an economic space through this invariant of the bonding curve, you can say, well, I don't know what agents in the system will do, but I know that they will be on this surface as we've defined it. They could be over here, they could be over here, but they are somewhere on this space. And now we can start to do higher level engineering design and mathematical design, knowing that they're at least somewhere on that space. And that's the bonding curve. I guess I went a little bit more mathematical with it than I normally do, but speaking of invariance and kind of engineering rigor, the bonding curve is where that starts, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, invariant is a geeky mathematical way to talk about essentially liberating structure is another way to talk about it, or design parameter. It's a parameter. It's something that creates a boundary, that creates a container that within which you can do certain things. Yeah. So like gravity is an invariant in it.
Right.
And the rotating, if it's just to expand that for our listeners, the metaphor that you're inviting here, so you have gravity, you have the moon, you have tidal flow, you have these particular parameters or invariants that created the conditions for life to arise, and in that way, what I'm hearing you say is you can consider, the bonding curve an optional invariant to impose onto a token economy so that certain conditions arise and user behavior then follows a pattern which can be sort of logically thought about and modeled and some other things. And that pattern, you can set the parameters of that and then get it going. And obviously you could also have some governance control over that foundational invariant. The word being used here. So that foundational parameter is what I would call it. And then so you get going. So you were talking about, let's describe what that invariant or parameter is, or what they are. Like, there's probably plural. There's probably multiple that sort of come together to form that. Can you describe that just a little bit more? Because you were talking about, it's about the exchange rate. You get a token in, you get X tokens out, and then in order to get those, if you want to get your original investment back, you can, etc. Land us a little bit more deeply. And is there an example of one of these that's out in the wild yet, or not quite?
There are a few. There's a couple on mainnet. Outside of the automated market makers. So there's, as with any like new technology, I think the definitions of these things are still evolving. So Bancor is one example of a bonding curve type mechanism. Uniswap is similar. Balancer is kind of a multi-dimensional Uniswap. Molecule Catalyst launched a bonding curve for actually fundraising psilocybin research for depression at the University of Toronto, which was really interesting. So there's a number of bonding curves that are out there right now, and I think we're still only verging on the beginning of our understanding of these systems. So basically, it's the bonding curve is any way or any two values in a system related reduced in dimensionality. So you're now on a curve. So this could be financial in that you put money in, you get tokens out. Now you belong to this cyber physical commons, this community that is, has this local token. You could also use a bonding curve to relate to things like upload volume to download volume in a BitTorrent network. So, I think the free rider problem is very clear in BitTorrent networks. You have a lot of people that are willing to download, but very few willing to upload. And you have issues there where, the people who are uploading, are spending a lot of money and data to provide a service to all of these people who are just basically taking from the system. So with a bonding curve, you could say, hey, look, you can only download this if you upload this, and plot that on a curve. So you could have, basically a ingrained mechanism to relate those two values in some way, or I think there are non-financial applications of the bonding curve that are still out there to be discovered and developed for different use cases. But you had a separate question there. I think a good analogy for this is we can now design economic worlds. When we have physical worlds, and in the physical world there are certain invariants that we can't really control, but they also build stability in our world. The reason this table doesn't fall down is because gravity is constant. If gravity was changing every 10 minutes, my house wouldn't stand, my table wouldn't stand up. And in a lot of crypto experiments today, I think without invariance, you can come in and you can exert a certain force and break these systems. And that's, I think, a vulnerability of a lot of crypto systems today. But when we get down the ability to create invariance in these token economies, we will create stable economic space. And when you think about architecting economic space, you can draw some parallels to architecting physical space. There was a time that the corridor was first invented. Before corridors, you just had massive open rooms and people milled about, and maybe people went over to the corner and maybe people walked up to the throne. But once you developed a corridor, you're kind of guiding human behavior. You're able to say, this is, and that's not necessarily intuitive. Someone still may just go in a circle in the corridor, but social norms and behavioral norms will allow people to move through the corridor to the end of the hall, which is where the architect wants them to go. Now we can be economic architects. We can create an economic corridor in the same way that we can create a physical corridor. And we're not saying people have to move through that corridor how we plan, but you're providing some kind of environmental cue that this is the direction to go. And if you think about that more broadly, we can create an incentive gradient. If you are on top of the hill, you are, in the case of Regen Network, you are incurring a lot of carbon costs. I mean, that's expensive to do. You can do it, but you're going up the hill. You're paying to do that. More people will be likely to go down into the valley because you're incentivized to be in the valley. If you cut your carbon, you are down here on the incentive gradient, and the people that are up here, you're not stopping them from polluting, but you are charging them to do so, and those costs are brought to the people that are in the economic valley. So you're kind of creating this like economic topology, and you're saying to people, you have maximum freedom to go wherever you want on this economic topology, but if you want to go up that hill, it's going to cost you more, and you are going to be subsidizing the people who are down here in the valley who are cutting their CO2 footprint, for example. So I think that's an interesting analogy of the new kinds of economic spaces we're able to design with these kinds of invariants.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's super exciting, and I think yeah, I'm interested to see how this sort of bundle of conviction voting, bonding curves, quadratic voting, quadratic funding, there's this sort of like set of emerging, really interesting ways of architecting, the behavior of agents in a system. Obviously, with the caveat that you want the users to be able to govern the choice to both participate in the system and to upgrade the system that they're participating in. If
Right.
and if you're a user and you find you can't upgrade it, or you're in the minority who, the majority doesn't want it, then you exit and you make your change somewhere else or what have you. And so that's
Right.
It's exciting, and I'm very excited to start to engage in bringing some. We've sort of had our heads down in what we've had our heads down in, which is kind of more like, on one side it's the science side of things. Actually just the science. How do you create a rigorous attestation about ecological state? What does that look like? Just like practically, not in the like fantasy techno-determinism land where there's some binary Boolean like this happened or that happened, which is not how it works. It's a probabilistic, sort of complex comparative. You're bringing in all this information and you're stacking it into, building kind of, I guess in a way, the digital twin of ecological state that people can look at and say, yeah, that does represent the reality in that particular place on Earth. So we've been working a lot on that on the science side, and then just like on the, sort of like layer one, how do you make sure that users can govern the tools that are being deployed in order to make trust? And I'm very excited that this sort of parallel trend has happened where people who weren't as persnickety as myself and our team about like, but no, we need to be able to govern the layer one. We can't just have somebody can't just run on some deterministic thing. It's some, that doesn't make any sense at all. That the people who are less, like a little bit more relaxed about that in the short term have sprinted ahead and started building these building blocks, and we're starting to see the feedback when it works, when it doesn't, how to deploy it. It's very exciting. It feels like there's, we're just about to sort of crescendo into a new, like, move up an octave is what it feels like.
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree that a lot of these tools are still nascent. They're not quite there yet. And I think the Common Stack itself has, some very interesting research directions, but each of these tools on their own is quite a rabbit hole. The mathematics of the bonding curve is a lot. Then imagining conviction voting, how these things come together in an ecosystem where we can make sure that they're being developed in the interest of all stakeholders. There's such a cross-disciplinary endeavor, and it's a massive project. It's not anything that any one team can do, and I think that's another hope of the Common Stack, is to bring people into the kind of engineering, token engineering design, because we we can't do it all. We don't want to do it all. There are so many different contexts and use cases and tools, but we just want to say, hey, here's an interoperable framework and a modular framework for design, and all. A lot of that comes down to the engineering design. Designing a part isn't necessarily hard, but designing a system composed of multiple different parts is much more difficult. You can build a screw and say, hey, this is a screw, but as soon as you put that screw into an I-beam and that I-beam into a bridge, then the engineering looks at the bounds of the system, and where the bound of that part ends and the next part begins is usually where it breaks. So this is why we need to be really careful with the way we design these systems to be interoperable and modular, and being able to move forward so that we're all able to build on a lot of the other work that's been done. We're really excited to see that happening more and more in the space. And actually, I wanted to backtrack to the bonding curve for a sec, because I think I got a little high level on the the theoretical, and I think there's something much more tangible in terms of making the bonding curve a useful tool. And actually, it's a point you brought up earlier about local currencies, which I realized I had a bunch in my wallet as well. These are the Bangla Pesa, Lindi Pesa, the first version of Will's community inclusion currencies. And you mentioned the Berkshires. The unfortunate thing was that they don't seem to be that much used, even though it's a great thought experiment. There's a lot of excitement around it, but there's very little, I guess, like tangible use. And I think the biggest downside of all these local currencies is they're basically islands. If you're on the island, it can be useful in your community, but as soon as you leave that community, it has no value to anyone else. There's no liquidity, there's no interoperability between these different currency systems.
Yeah, which is the Bancor vision, is to create the liquidity between the systems.
Exactly. And that's the promise of the bonding curve, is that there is some sort of like on-chain collateral that allows these currencies to relate to each other. So, if you have the Bangla Pesa and the Lindi Pesa, well, as soon as you leave either of those communities, what is the value of that currency? As soon as you have an on-chain verifiable collateral pool, you can always trade that back to fiat or to another local currency. And ultimately, it serves as the bridge between all these islands of local currency. And I think that's when we'll see the real benefits of alternative currency systems come about, is when you have bridges between all of these islands, and interoperability between currencies.
Yep. No, agreed. And there's different ways. It's interesting that people are approaching that in different ways. Bonding curves and liquidity pools are one part of that. And then in the Cosmos world, it's sort of like IBC becomes the bridge, and then each sovereign chain can kind of think about exchange rates, and you can have hubs and liquidity pools and contracts and collateralize different agreements and all sorts of things. So it's and I don't really know how that all lives in the Polkadot world, to be honest. I don't know how people are conceptualizing, but or I have a vague idea, but I don't really know. And then you have the holochain people, and that is even more confusing to me how that actually will work. But
yeah. It's amazing to see all of the different directions these explorations are taking shape, and it'll be really exciting to see over the coming years. As you say, like I've dipped my toes into a lot of these ecosystems, and often the technical details are a bit beyond me, but I think there are so many exciting areas of exploration, and a lot of it around the same, mutual credit, in the case of holochain. And I also don't have enough knowledge about the Polkadot ecosystem. I've got some more research to do, but I think that the lateral explorations across these various projects, and then figuring out where you want to dive deep, is a key decision for each person in the ecosystem right now. But I think there's so much to learn across projects, but then you also need to specialize in one to really make an impact and dive in on one area that we can make a difference.
I would really love a comparative, like, to see, and I think some work has started happening this, and I think you guys did a good job at the beginning of kind of, you know, saying, okay, here's the tools that are needed, here's the pattern for the pattern level, and here's the framework to think about it, agnostic of what, you know, how you code it up, which is great. And I would love to see at some point just sort of like a, you know, a cool interactive network topology, and, you know, that you can sort of like go in a couple layers and zoom back out and like see all the innovation taking place, how that's related, like mutual credit, who's working on mutual credit. There's different communities of people, you know, the Hollow community has done some great work there. But then there's also like we were noting earlier, there's great, like, you don't even need you know, especially in mutual credit, there's not necessarily a need for blockchain or consensus if you have trust in a admin person. I've been trying to wrap my head around. It seems like mutual credit is a very hard nut to crack in the blockchain world. I haven't seen any good solutions yet. Really.
Yeah, Trustlines just launched not too long ago, which is a really, really exciting tech stack. I haven't seen a lot of uptake, I guess, in terms of use. And again, that's like pure mutual credit is really difficult, I think. And this, I've spoken with Will a little bit about it. You know, it needs to be backed by something. And in Holochain, that's compute. So there's always something underlying that, which makes sense in a digital medium. And Will's opinion of it, you know, is we need a bunch of different currency systems, but all of those currencies need to be backed, you know, by something, whether it's the local shepherd backing the currency with goats, or, you know, the local Canadian Tire backing Canadian Tire money with tires. You know, there's always some asset that is redeemable for this currency, and pure mutual credit is a really tricky play because they're in the purest sense, it's just credit between two people without necessarily the asset backing that. But I think there's
the asset that's backing it is the labor. It's the debt, right? It's that you are agreeing that you're in debt, and so what's backing it is your agreement that you'll fulfill your debt.
Right.
I mean, I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to talk to Will about this.
You should have Will on. Definitely.
I'd love to have Will on. Yeah, I don't know that it's. I'm not convinced that, in a strict sense. Although I'm excited, it's like on one hand I'm very excited about, for instance, you know, Regen Network. The entire impulse of the vision was to have living capital backed currency, and the way that I actually see that happening is by creating like local and bioregional living capital sort of currency systems, probably using something like a bonding curve and a couple of other tools that's governed, and essentially has like a global exchange rate that's sort of programmatically or algorithmically related to the ecological health index. And those can then get aggregated into a sort of like a meta currency that, you know, essentially represents, you know, the health of a living system. And then you can start to price that in. Okay. So we're sort of like building blocks, and on the way there, we got to go to market and get some carbon credits, and we got to do this and we got to do that. We got to kind of like piece it all together so that there's users and stuff happening. Okay, we're moving. That said, you know, backing things isn't the only way to build trust. And what's really important is that people trust the currency, right? And backing is one way that people have traditionally, and that we can design for people to have trust. And there are other ways, such as coercion, coercive power, like pure brute force. That's another way.
Yeah. Seems to work in the world today.
You know, and probably shared belief systems and like tightly knit, like cultural coherence is another way you can back something. So anyway, there's just choices, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's a logical choice to back things.
Yeah, and I think this is also like a social and behavioral evolution as well. Like, you know, the democratization of currency creation in the beginning, there's a lot of mistrust, and therefore it's going to be slow, I think, off the uptake. But this was probably the same thing that happened when with the democratization of the printing press. The first books that came out were probably a joke, like they probably had poor binding, and they were writing about things that weren't really relevant, and the people who were printing the Bibles were looking at these first books and being like, man, what a joke. You think you guys are ever gonna this is ever gonna take off? Like, the Bible is obviously the book. Like, everyone's just gonna buy the book. No one's gonna buy all these trashy first generation books that were barely intelligible. But now, I mean, look at the state that we're in now. We've got literature that I think it's an evolutionary process. Once you democratize, there's a period where you need to figure out what this is actually useful for and how to use it properly, and then the kind of acceptance of these things comes along with that, and we usher in a new future that it's even hard to tell at this point in time what that may
hard
be.
to tell, but I think you're right, and I think the closest analogy to our current current historical epoch is the invention and spread of the printing press through Europe. And it's important to note that catalyzed the Reformation and the bloodiest, most fragmented, horrendous period in European history. And I think we're in similar times. I mean, I hope it doesn't need to be quite that bloody, but it's certainly, I think we're feeling the destabilization of, and we're working on the Web 3, but that's sort of like just a better printing press. Web 2, Web 1 is just web. It's web. And, we saw the intrinsic issues from a Web 2 approach, and VC and public market owned platforms, and the sense-making challenges that brings up, and the incentives and all of that stuff. Like, we're in the middle of it. It's like how people learn and how people get information is changing as radically as it did when all of a sudden there were books, and they weren't the Bible, and you could read a book that wasn't the Bible that somebody over there wrote about what they thought. That was a big move. And I think we're in the middle of another really big move in a similar sort of way.
Definitely. And I think that the potential it can unlock is massive. But as you say, that the process from here to there is not just a steady line of progress. I think there's in any new technological development, there are ups and there are downs and there are bumps, and it's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I mean, we're also playing this out on a global scale of ecological collapse and climate change, and there are all sorts of external pressures on this process as well that may trigger more difficulties or at the same time more opportunities. Since COVID started, I've heard people asking questions that make this work far more relevant, and even just a couple months ago I would never have expected those questions to be asked around universal basic income or fair distribution of resources. I think in the status quo of the world just up to a couple months ago, it was a lot of these things were unquestioned, and now we are kind of find ourselves in great times of crisis. We also have great opportunity, and how we choose to move forward through that, I think, is the place that we're at right now.
Yep. And we've been procrastinating some changes that are being forced by some deadlines. So
right.
Change will happen, whether it turns into the, whether it goes the way we hope or not. So we better just, now it's time to just do it. I do think we've got 10 or 20 years now that are just kind of like the, how we behave as humans and is going to ripple, like small changes in this moment of time create really big changes, like completely different historical scenarios are unfolding out there, depending on how things happen. And again, like to circle back, that's why social coordination technology is so key, because unlocking the collective intelligence and improving sense making and up-leveling our ability to cooperate and engage with complexity and evolve a human society that's, in my language, that's regenerative, that our whole North Star is really around the human species stepping up into a role as a keystone species in planetary ecology, where the outcome of our existence is biodiversity and a thriving biosphere. That's just intrinsic. That's intrinsic. That is, to go back to the language that you were using, that becomes an invariant. The things that are needed for our the human economy to create planetary regeneration as the natural native outgrowth is just like, that's just how it happens, right? That's the goal. That's the North Star.
Yeah. And I think, Web3 tech and tokenization allows us to begin to design like nature. And I think blockchain up until now gets maybe a fairly due rap for being overly financialized. But when we start talking about tokens, not just as money, but tokens as governance, tokens as reputation, tokens as badges, now we can start to design alternative systems that act like nature. We don't necessarily have to have centralized systems of failure. One of the examples I gave for community currencies as an economic intervention for COVID, our economic system as a centralized issuance system is kind of like a circulatory system. And we're going to be going through all these economic heart attacks. There are going to be liquidity crises. Currency is a flow in the meta organism of humanity. It's flowing opposite to goods and services. So you have services flowing one way, currency flowing the other. But when you have economic shocks, it's like the system having a heart attack and the currency is not able to flow. But if we look at value transmission systems in nature like mycelium, you actually have kind of like overlapping multi-dimensional networks of value. So mushrooms don't have heart attacks. If you can layer multiple community currencies over top of each other that don't have this centralized issuance and liquidity crises, we will be able to design much more resilient systems in the face of external shocks like pandemics or climate change or anything else. And I think that's the opportunity that we're really verging on, is being able to design our economic and governance systems as we see those systems existing in nature, and really learning from those patterns and moving forward into an age where we can, who knows what's possible.
Who knows what's possible? Planetary regeneration. Yeah. Wow, there's so many. I just have about 5 minutes left. There's so many places that I still want to go with the conversation. I think, I think maybe that's a good, maybe if you could leave us with, what are you reading right now? What's inspiring you right now? What has your interest and attention?
A lot of my research lately has been in trying to translate some of these crypto topics into existing, financial mechanisms that people can understand. So doing some reading on, bonds, convertible bonds, stocks, and it's really helped me to examine legacy financial systems through the context of token ecosystems, and really wondering, like company stocks are kind of like, allowing Apple to create their own token. And then you say, well, what are like stock buybacks? It's like, okay, well, a stock buyback is actually just like the founders pumping and dumping their own token for creating value in this ecosystem. And being able to analyze kind of the existing financial system through the models that we're now developing in token ecosystems, you really see some of the strange things that exist in our currency creation systems. And, you know, governments and corporations are currently the two largest kind of like institutions that exist in the world that we, you know, as individuals minding climate change, yes, I can make individual choices, but really the change is going to come when a government mandates something, or when a corporation. And I started thinking, like, why do they have all this power? And it's because they are the ones that are able to create these currency ecosystems. And now we can give that power to the community as well through these, you know, Web3 tools, and allow them to, you know, be on the same playing field. We can give the commons a leg up in their, you know, in kind of the civic, public, private, or corporate, you know, triad. We can put the commons on a even playing field with these other forms of institutional
the
power.
civic commons. Yeah. And that's a cool model. It's a really cool mental model to think about that triad and the imbalance there that's happened recently. Yeah, it's cool. Cool. Well, thank you so much for hopping on. It's been a fantastic conversation. Let's do it again soon.
Definitely. And I think there's more we can riff on. I still have so many questions about Regen Network that, you know, I know I went on a couple of tangents today, so I definitely want to pick your brain more. I know you guys are really pushing for it. I actually just shared you guys on my Facebook page. You got a lot of positive feedback from some of my friends who are interested in what I'm doing, but it's still, again, kind of a level too theoretical, you know. So I think Regen Network is a really great you know, rallying flag for the people who don't necessarily want to dive into the crypto economics, but they understand the power of you know, incentivizing a regenerative planet. And keep up the good work. You guys are on a roll.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. All right, I'm just gonna pause that. Cool. Well, that was a lot of fun. Thank you. We should do it again, and definitely would love to swap ideas. I've been having the brainwave. I'm right now. I'm in the middle of. I'm going to turn off